Behind the gilded frames and serene expressions of the 17th and 18th centuries, a secret lies hidden in plain sight. We see the faces of an era, monarchs and philosophers, aristocrats and thinkers, an entire age, known to us as the Enlightenment, presents itself shrouded in powdered wigs and silken finery. Yet an unsettling uniformity stares back from these canvases, a glaring omission we have been conditioned to ignore. Among these countless portraits, there is scarcely a single soul depicted with their own natural hair. We have been presented with a carefully curated, yet profoundly distorted version of reality. The official narrative, repeated by generations of historians, offers a simple explanation. It was merely fashion, a whim of the wealthy. We are told that men and women shaved their heads to escape the scourge of lice and filth. But here, the story begins to unravel. We are asked to believe that an aristocracy capable of erecting palaces of breathtaking complexity, of commissioning timeless masterpieces of art, could devise no better solution to hygiene than to wear a suffocating, heavy mass of another's hair, or the wool of an animal. The official version fractures under the slightest scrutiny. Consider the claim of sanitation. A wig, crafted from horsehair or human strands, heavily treated with animal fat and powder, is not a deterrent to parasites. It is a perfect incubator. Warm, humid, and nearly impossible to properly clean. If hygiene were the true objective, far simpler methods were readily available. Closely cropped hair or a cleanly shaven scalp, wiped with the alcohol or vinegar present in every household of the era. But instead, they chose to don kilograms of dead organic matter. Why? The answer may be that they did not choose to wear these contraptions. They were compelled to. The goal was not cleanliness, but concealment. The absence of hair was not a hygienic choice, but a profound stigma, the outward sign of a terrible affliction. This was not fashion. It was a masquerade on a continental scale. We are not witnessing the whims of the elite. We are looking at the evidence of a silent epidemic. An epidemic of boldness. Consider the sheer scale of this phenomenon. From London to St. Petersburg, from Paris to the American colonies, tens of thousands of people suddenly appear without their natural adornment. In the letters, memoirs, and medical records of the time, documents often sidestepped by conventional history, the descriptions are not of voluntary shaving, but of catastrophic hair loss. A total alopecia. In this light, the wig is transformed. It is no longer an accessory, but a prosthesis. A desperate attempt to hide a physical disfigurement that had suddenly and inexplicably struck an entire generation of the ruling class. The very people who were meant to be the standard bearers of health and vitality. The polished surfaces of history often conceal a far more fragile truth. We gaze upon these portraits, seeing power, reason, and grace. But perhaps what we are truly witnessing is a collective illusion, a society desperately clinging to an image of normalcy while concealing a vast, unspoken affliction. The faces of the past look back at us, not in vanity, but in silence, guarding a secret we were never meant to uncover. History tells us it was a campaign to instill European culture. But what if the official record has the story backward? What if the sovereign, or the one who occupied his throne, was concealing a terrifying truth? Beards had simply stopped growing. Across a vast portion of the population, irreversible changes were unfolding within the human body. The infamous beard tax, then, was not a policy of modernization. It was a masterful act of social engineering, a way to legitimize beardlessness. If one could not grow hair upon the face, one simply paid a fine, or declared oneself a modern European. In this way, a physical deficiency, born of some unknown external force, was brilliantly rebranded as a mark of the elite. Those who retained the ability were cast as backward barbarians. Those who had lost it were hailed as progressive aristocrats. It is a classic inversion of reality, a tool social architects have wielded for centuries. But the loss of hair was merely the beginning. If this affliction was so widespread, so sudden, it points to a physical cause on a global scale. And if we look closer at the faces of that era, hidden beneath layers of paint and powder, a picture emerges that is chilling to the bone. For if hair was the first loss the elite sought to hide beneath wigs, then a further study of their appearance reveals the scale of a true biological tragedy. We must look upon the faces that stare out from the grand portraits, not as works of art, but as medical records. Vast quantities of white lead, ceruse powder, cinnabar, and arsenic. Men and women alike were caking their skin with pounds of this poisonous plaster. Official history assures us this was the canon of beauty, that a deathly pallor was the ultimate sign of high birth. But healthy skin has no need to be masked beneath a finger-thick layer of toxic metal. This was not aesthetics. It was a desperate concealment. What, precisely, were they hiding so diligently, even with the knowledge that these cosmetics were slowly poisoning their bodies? The answer lies in a symptomatology that is impossible to ignore. Ulcers, sores that would not heal, strange pigmentations, and lesions bearing an uncanny resemblance to radiation burns. The skin of the 18th century aristocracy was ravaged by something that could not, under any circumstances, be revealed. The fear of exposing the true state of their faces was more powerful than the fear of a slow, agonizing death from heavy metal poisoning. We are confronted not with a shift in fashion, but with evidence of a mass biological event, where culture became the elaborate shroud for a global pathology. It forces us to ask, what other truths remain buried beneath the veneer of history, disguised as the march of progress? By the age of 30 or 40, the dental arch was often a ruin, a near-complete absence of teeth. We are often shown the example of the first American president, George Washington, whose mouth was a grim landscape of elaborate prosthetics. Historians point to the rising tide of sugar consumption as the culprit. But in that era, sugar was a treasure, an indulgence for the very few. It alone cannot account for a wholesale necrosis of the jaw, afflicting an entire social class in unison. The symptoms, rotting gums, dissolving bone tissue, are the classic signatures of severe heavy metal poisoning, or the insidious touch of radiation. A poison that accumulates in the bones, inducing what would later be called radium jaw. This reframes the artifacts of the age. The elegant fans, which ladies and gentlemen so artfully wielded, were not merely instruments of flirtation. They were a defense, a desperate measure to ward off the putrid breath of decay emanating from a conversation partner. Notice, too, the curious evolution of attire. The high, standing collars, the voluminous jabots, the neckerchiefs that shrouded a person to the very chin. They were a concealment. The thyroid gland is the first organ to react to an aggressive radiation field or toxic contamination. An epidemic of throat ailments, the emergence of goiters, and the scars from forced surgeries compelled tailors to create fashions that completely obscured the neck. Gloves, worn even indoors, hid what lay beneath: deformed nails and ulcerated skin. The aristocracy was, quite literally, rotting alive. Their wardrobe was not a statement of wealth, but a shroud to mask the inexorable process of disintegration. Here we must reassess the medicine of the time, so often dismissed as barbaric. To open an old pharmacopoeia is to be gripped by dread. The primary medicine was mercury. The principal procedure, bloodletting. We are told the physicians were ignorant, but this is a profound misreading. The same minds that engineered complex navigational systems and calculated the orbits of planets understood the toxicity of mercury perfectly well. The use of this heavy metal was a desperate, primitive form of chemotherapy. Within certain brutal protocols, mercury could be used as an agent to displace other, more dangerous isotopes or toxins from the body. They were not drinking mercury and inhaling its vapors out of foolishness. They were attempting to arrest the swift and total ruin of their bodies. The same logic applies to bloodletting. Historians mock the practice of draining pints of blood for any ailment, but viewed through the lens of a critical environmental poisoning, it becomes a terrifyingly logical act. When the lymphatic system is overwhelmed with the byproducts of decay, when the blood itself is saturated with toxins, its mechanical removal is a crude but effective dialysis. They drained the contaminated fluid, hoping the body might generate new, purer blood. This was not superstition. It was the harsh, unwritten logic of survival in the face of a biological catastrophe. Perhaps what we have long dismissed as the folly of our ancestors is, in fact, a silent testament, a desperate record of a battle against an invisible enemy we have yet to fully comprehend. The bodies of the elite were failing. It was a slow, inexorable collapse, a decay that began from within, and all their actions became a desperate, frantic scramble to prolong life at any cost. But this frantic struggle raises a more terrifying question. The loss of hair, the lesions on the skin, the disintegration of bone, the failure of organs. These were all symptoms. Symptoms of what? Why did this precise constellation of afflictions plague an entire class of people simultaneously on different continents? The probability of such a specific malady arising by chance is zero. We are forced to confront the conclusion that the very environment they inhabited had undergone a global, catastrophic change. The aristocracy, with access to the best food and protection, were paradoxically the first to fall, precisely because they stood at the epicenter of the event. What exactly were these people breathing? What happened in the Earth's atmosphere shortly before the dawn of the so-called gallant century that turned the planet into a poisoned trap? If we accept as fact that the biological forms of the ruling class were rapidly decaying, rotting, losing their vitality, then we are compelled to take the next logical step. We must acknowledge that the world around them had become aggressive. The human body is a self-regulating system. For it to begin failing on such a scale, across thousands of individuals at once, the external force must have been total. We approach a theory that is seldom spoken in the halls of classical history. The theory that the Earth's atmosphere during that period was toxic. One hypothesis posits that human hair functions as a kind of biological antenna, an indicator of the body's state. It is the first to react to changes in the chemical composition of the air and to shifts in the radiation background. In an environment of global contamination, in the very ether that all life breathed, the hair follicles simply withered, unable to withstand the toxic load. It was a mass failure of the endocrine system, a desperate attempt to save vital organs by shedding the ballast of the hair and skin. And it is here we collide with another glaring contradiction, one that historians prefer to dismiss as the whims of architects. It is an architectural dissonance that screams of an environment changed instantly and catastrophically. Look to the palaces of St. Petersburg, of Paris, of Vienna. These are structures with gargantuan windows of single-pane glass, enormous halls, and impossibly high ceilings reaching 5 to 6 meters. And all of this, according to the official timeline, was built during the climax of the Little Ice Age. We are told the climate was so severe that birds would fall from the sky, frozen in mid-flight, and great rivers would freeze to their very beds. Consider the absurdity. The aristocrats, suffering from illness and cold, supposedly built for themselves colossal stone chambers that were physically impossible to heat. Bald and weakened people, dressed in silk stockings, shivering in the echoing grandeur of their own magnificent tombs. Perhaps the powdered wigs and the soaring ceilings were not monuments to vanity, but desperate measures of survival. Perhaps the accepted narrative is not a record of history, but a veil drawn over a time when the very air was an enemy, and the world we thought we knew had become irrevocably alien. In powdered wigs and silk, they would have perished from the cold. These grandiose halls, these monuments to an age of supposed enlightenment, were deathly tombs in winter. The fireplaces we see today offer a clue. They are often cosmetic afterthoughts, primitive hearths, crudely retrofitted into walls, never designed to hold them. Their heat is a flickering gesture, utterly lost in the colossal volumes of air, their efficiency negligible for chambers stretching across hundreds of square meters. This points to an unavoidable conclusion. These structures were either engineered for a forgotten subtropical climate, or they were warmed by a technology now lost to us. A system that required no hearth, no chimney, no flame. The truth that emerges is stark and uncompromising. The people of that era did not build these cities. They found them. The epoch we call the time of great construction was, in fact, an era of great occupation. The bewigged aristocrats were not genius architects, but squatters, refugees on their own planet. They moved into the vacant, perhaps partially ruined cities of a far more advanced predecessor civilization. They fitted their own primitive wooden frames into giant apertures built for glazing standards we cannot comprehend, or perhaps for no glass at all. They hung their portraits over intricate carvings whose meaning was lost to them, and called this founding a city, when it was merely an inventory of magnificent ruins. These were a people at odds with their environment, forced to conceal their freezing bodies beneath layers of fabric and fur, even indoors. They settled the ruins, attempting to keep warm by primitive hearths in the homes of giants. They were marauders, appropriating a grandeur to which they had no connection. This is why the ruinist painters of the era depicted majestic, overgrown structures with almost photographic precision, standing in the heart of their supposedly thriving capitals. This was not artistic fantasy, it was documentary, the quiet testimony of a world inherited, not built. But the most profound evidence of this global catastrophe lies not in the high architecture or on aging canvases. The most irrefutable proof is buried directly beneath our feet. We walk past it every day. Our gaze sweeps over it, but a mind programmed by conventional history refuses to register the anomaly. The secret is held in the basements of our oldest buildings. Walk the historic heart of any ancient city, be it Moscow, Prague, Rome, or London. Look closely at a detail the brain has been trained to filter out as insignificant. You will see the same impossible picture. Windows of what should be the first floor, plunging deep below the modern street level, transformed into subterranean embrasures. We are told these are cellars, but the architecture screams otherwise. These were once ground floors, open to the light and air of a world that now lies meters below our own. A world buried by a catastrophe so immense, its evidence has been mistaken for foundations. We live and walk upon the ruins of an unknown past, a civilization whose greatest monuments we call our own, while its true story remains silent, entombed in the very earth we tread. They call it the cultural layer. Official science would have us believe that over the course of 200 or 300 years, humanity simply discarded so much refuse, so much waste and mud, that the ground level of our cities rose by 3 or even 4 meters. We are asked to accept that the inhabitants of Europe's great capitals were so profoundly indolent, so indifferent to their own squalor, that they never cleared their waste. Instead, they simply compacted it, year after year, building new roads directly over the first floors of their own homes. Consider the monstrous absurdity of this claim. Are we truly to believe that aristocrats in their snow-white cravats, their powdered wigs and costly coats, men who so fanatically curated their status and appearance, spent decades wading knee-deep through their own filth? Would the owners of opulent mansions simply allow their grand entrances and windows to be consumed by grime, transforming entire floors of their living spaces into darkened cellars? This is a falsehood, one that relies on a complete absence of critical thought across an entire city. No cultural layer of this magnitude has ever existed. Before us lies irrefutable evidence of a global catastrophe, of the Great Flood, or a colossal mudflow of planetary scale which smothered a civilization beneath a dense shroud of clay and silt. And here we return to our hairless aristocrats, where the link between the buried floors and the powdered wigs becomes chillingly direct. The cataclysm that entombed the ground floors of these buildings did not bring mere soil. This deluge of clay was saturated with heavy chemical elements, or perhaps radioactive isotopes. The very ground gave off a toxic breath. Those who survived, or those who came to these lands in the immediate aftermath, found themselves at the epicenter of a radiological or chemical contamination zone. Vapors rising from this damp, toxic clay, which covered every meter of urban space, struck at the most vulnerable parts of the human body. The endocrine system, the very code of our genetics. They were living, quite literally, upon the radioactive landfill of history. This is precisely why the nobility sought to live as high as possible. Recall the classic layout of ancient buildings. The first floor was always relegated to servants, kitchens, or utilitarian purposes, while the masters occupied the so-called bel étage, the noble floor, on the second or third level. This was not a whim. It was a matter of survival. The closer to the earth, the closer to this cultural layer, the more potent the ruinous effects. But even this could not save them. The atmosphere itself was poisoned. An epidemic of hair loss swept through the populace, becoming a defining marker of the degeneration of an entire class. Now, let us place the physical state of these people alongside the technological achievements credited to them. Official history asserts that this very generation, treating its ailments with mercury, suffering from the loss of hair and teeth, lacking even rudimentary sanitation, was supposedly responsible for erecting these grandiose and complex structures. We are left to confront a stark incongruity, a story of magnificent creation attributed to an age of profound decay. It forces us to ask not only how they built their world, but whether the world they inherited was ever truly theirs to begin with. Across the skin of the planet, a silent testament is etched in stone. Granite embankments, star fortresses, a global network of impossible geometry. Have you truly seen them? They are not mere forts. They are flawless mathematical constructs, surveyed to the inch, clad in multi-ton blocks of stone. They are assembled with a polygonal mastery so precise that a razor's edge cannot find purchase between them. The official histories tell a simple story. They tell of soldiers armed with little more than shovels and wheelbarrows. This is a narrative that defies physics. The sheer volume of earth and stone moved for the construction of a single one of these stars surpasses the physical capacity of any army of that era, even if they were to labor without food or sleep. And there are not dozens, but thousands of them, from the heart of Europe to the shores of Japan, from the Americas to Australia. Who then were the architects? The frail figures we see in portraits, the ailing aristocrats, their bodies ravaged by lead and mercury, their lives cut short before the age of 40. No, they did not build, they unearthed. The era we celebrate as a renaissance of architecture was, in truth, an age of colossal archaeology. They were merely clearing the debris of a forgotten epoch, polishing the ancient brickwork of giants, and claiming the titanic works of their predecessors as their own. But this revelation unearths a far more unsettling question. If the cities were buried, and the technologically advanced population that built them had perished or devolved, then who settled these excavated ruins? From where did the millions of people who flooded the cities in the 19th century suddenly appear? The birth rate of a diseased elite would have plummeted to zero, and the peasantry could never have produced such an explosive surge in the aftermath of a global cataclysm. Let us turn away from speculation and toward the cold, dispassionate language of statistics, a force that can demolish the official narrative faster than any dynamite. Examine the demographic charts of the 19th century. You'll be confronted with a phenomenon that defies all conventional biological explanation. The curve of human population does not gently ascend. It launches, almost vertically, in an exponential explosion. We are offered explanations. Sudden improvements in medicine, an agricultural revolution. Yet we have seen the reality. The medicine of the time was a dangerous cocktail of mercury and bloodletting. The cities were mired in clay and filth. In an environment of total anti-sanitation, of raging cholera and typhus epidemics, with a complete absence of antibiotics or modern hygiene, the population of Earth suddenly began to double, and then triple, in record time. This is a mathematical and biological impossibility. Women could not physically bear and sustain that many offspring in such monstrous conditions. The numbers lead to only one logical, if terrifying, conclusion. This was not a natural boom. It was an insertion. A mass influx of an adult or adolescent population from an unknown source, or perhaps something even more systematic. The industrial cultivation of human beings on a scale never imagined. And it is here, against this backdrop of impossible growth, that a new and enigmatic institution appears on the historical stage, the so-called foundling home. These were not quaint orphanages. They were colossal structures in the fog of a history that may have been written to conceal rather than to reveal. In St. Petersburg, London, and Paris, they rose almost in unison. Colossal structures built on an unprecedented scale. One need only look at the plans for the Moscow foundling home. This was no modest shelter for orphans. It was a veritable factory, a sprawling palace complex dwarfing many royal residences. Its facade stretched for hundreds of meters, its internal infrastructure resembling an autonomous city. The question hangs in the air, heavy and unanswered. Why would the state expend millions in gold rubles and thousands of tons of scarce brick on the illegitimate children of an era that was supposed to despise and reject them? Official statistics claim that millions of infants passed through the doors of these homes. In a deeply religious society, where a child born out of wedlock was considered a grave sin, where did such a colossal tide of abandoned children originate? We are told the cause was poverty. Yet even in the depths of destitution, maternal instinct rarely falters on such a mass scale. It defies the most basic drive for the survival of one's lineage. A more chilling hypothesis suggests these foundling homes were not sanctuaries of mercy at all, but something else entirely. Distribution centers, or perhaps incubators. Within the archives, strange records surface. Mentions of infants arriving by the thousand in vast convoys, without documents, without names or surnames. They were simply assigned from? One theory suggests they were the children seized from the populations of conquered territories, from those who remembered an older world. But there is a more radical theory, one that speaks of cloning, of artificial gestation technologies left behind by a prior civilization and reactivated by the world's new masters to rapidly replenish the labor force. They did not need citizens, they needed slaves. They needed hands to excavate buried cities, to lay the iron arteries of railways, and to toil in the factories. The ideal slave, after all, is one who does not remember their parents, knows nothing of their history, and feels no bond of ancestry. Consider the peculiar Victorian fascination with Cabbage Patch postcards. A seemingly innocent myth, babies being found among the leaves. But why were there thousands of these cards? Why do they depict endless fields, literally sown with infocieties? Nothing is accidental. Perhaps this was a direct allusion to bioengineering. The cabbage, a metaphor for a complex, layered artificial structure. A hint that the population was being restored not by natural means, but through a global resettlement operation. This would also explain the sudden emergence of countless new noble families, appearing as if from nowhere. Their surnames simply invented, their titles bestowed upon the most loyal graduates of these very incubators, who would then become the overseers of all the rest. It forces a disquieting question. If the foundation of a society is built not on lineage, but on production, what does that make of identity itself? When a person has no history to claim, they are a blank slate upon which any future and any servitude can be written. A new social hierarchy was being forged from the mass of humanity. The foundling homes became the forges of a new kind of person, obedient, standardized, and severed from all roots. This was a generation with no memory of its own lineage. They were raised in the stark conditions of barracks, given only minimal skills, and taught a simplified, primitive language. This is the reason we know nothing of the catastrophe. The chain of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, was not merely broken, it was violently severed. Between us and our true ancestors stands a wall built of this incubator generation, whose memory began with a cot in a state-run home and the shrill sound of a warden's whistle. They were a blank slate. And upon this slate, the new elites, the architects of this new age, would write the history that served them. A history designed to explain to these millions of orphans who they were and the nature of the world they now inhabited. The greatest substitution of concepts in history had been accomplished. This artificially engineered generational gap became the ideal foundation upon which to build a new past. Millions of children, deprived of ancestral memory and connection, with a clean canvas on which the surviving elite could inscribe any postulate they wished. It was in this moment that the most profound sabotage was committed, not only against the chronicles of history, but against the fundamental sciences themselves. Those who came to power in the 19th century faced a dual challenge: to manage the remnants of humanity and to command an army of newly created workers amidst the ruins of a world whose technology they either failed to fully comprehend or deliberately sought to conceal. They needed to simplify reality, to reduce it to a level a worker at a machine could understand, and to erase any memory of a time when energy was free and available to all. Consider how, from Mendeleev's original periodic place, ether, the zero element, mysteriously vanished. This was not merely a chemical term. It was the concept of a universal medium, a fabric of reality pervading all space, which allowed for the extraction of energy, quite literally, from the air. The ancient cathedrals with their soaring spires, their domes and their metal frameworks, the great star forts, whose purpose has long been debated, these were not originally religious or military structures as we understand them today. They were stations for the collection, concentration, and transmission of atmospheric electricity. The gilded domes, the complex geometric forms, the abundance of metal, all were components in a single, global energy network, operating on principles that today would be dismissed as fantasy. After the cataclysm and the seizure of control, this technology was declared forbidden. The new masters of the world literally cut the wires. They dismantled the resonators, stripped the metallic connections where they could, and declared these high-technology complexes to be temples. Temples for the worship of gods they themselves had just codified into new religious canons. The power plants of the old world became the houses of prayer for the new, their original purpose buried under layers of ritual and dogma, hidden in plain sight. Humanity was denied its inheritance. Instead of the clean, limitless energy of the ether, we were shackled to a hydrocarbon economy, to coal, oil, and gas. The reason was devastatingly simple. That which must be wrested from the earth, transported and consumed, can be controlled, metered, and sold. The ether, however, is omnipresent. It cannot be owned. To forbid these technologies was to enslave humanity through the chokehold of consumption. In this grand design, the powdered aristocracy played a role not of sovereigns, but of wardens, the colonial administration of a broken world. They were the liquidators of a past catastrophe. Middle managers granted the right to inhabit the surviving palaces and bear hollow titles. Their currency was loyalty. Their price was absolute silence. Their ailments, their mutations, the physical defects hidden beneath layers of powder and elaborate wigs. These were the cost of proximity to the old world. They were the price for contact with artifacts that still pulsed with a dangerous, unseen radiation. The wig was not a statement of fashion, but a uniform of concealment, the mark of a caste initiated into a terrible secret, separating them from the uninitiated masses. A new history was invented for us, a tale of ancient Rome and Greece, its chronology stretched by thousands of years. This was done to artificially lengthen the timeline, to sever the connection between ages, to make us forget. We were told we descended from primitive ancestors so that we might never guess the truth, that we are the degraded descendants of titans, or perhaps, more tragically, the result of genetic engineering built upon their bones. We now live as a cargo cult, dwelling in the ruins of a world we cannot comprehend. We marvel at the columns, porticos, and arches, believing them to be mere decoration, when they were once functional nodes in a system of forgotten physics. We walk on streets beneath which lie the true first floors of our cities, buried by a cataclysm we are not meant to remember. But any system built upon a lie is destined to fracture. The effect of this mass hypnosis is beginning to fade. A genetic memory, impossible to erase completely, is stirring. People are noticing the inconsistencies, asking the inconvenient questions, and seeing what was once hidden in plain sight. Why did stoneworking technology devolve from perfect polygonal masonry to crude brick and mortar? Why do ancient maps depict thriving cities where today there are only deserts? Our entire official history is a threadbare veil stretched across a decaying frame. The Great Reset is not a threat looming on the horizon. It is a scar in our history. We are living in the final days of its cycle. And now that you know where to look, you can never again unsee the truth. It is etched into the very fabric of our world. Step outside, into your own city. Look at the granite embankments, carved with a precision our current technology cannot replicate. And ask yourself, not what they are, but what they were. Peer into the lifeless eyes staring back from antique portraits. And ask yourself, is this truly the world chronicled in our histories? Or is it merely a set piece, a grand stage concealing the truth of an almost unimaginable crime against humanity? The masquerade persists. But now, the strings that guide the puppets are becoming visible to those who dare to look. The challenge is to gaze even deeper, to finally comprehend what precisely had to be erased to build this world of illusion. For once a truth is unearthed, it can never be buried again, and the world it reveals is one from which there is no return.